I knew something was off the moment I saw the landscaping trucks pull up to my property line without permission, but I never imagined the chain reaction that would follow. My name is James Lawson, and I had lived in Meadowbrook Hills, Georgia for 6 years before everything went sideways. The subdivision was one of those newer developments outside Atlanta, built in 2016 with cookie-cutter colonials and strict HOA bylaws that regulated everything from mailbox colors to the height of your grass. When I bought my house on Oak Ridge Drive, I knew what I was signing up for. The HOA president at the time was a reasonable guy named Tom who mostly left everyone alone as long as you kept your yard decent and paid your dues. Then, Tom moved to Florida, and everything changed. Enter Brenda Patterson, a 47-year-old real estate agent who had apparently been waiting her entire life for the opportunity to micromanage an entire neighborhood. She swept into the HOA president position with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people joining cults. Within 3 months, she had tripled the number of violation notices, created a Facebook group where she posted photos of problem properties, and started attending every single board meeting with a 3-ring binder full of complaints. My problems with Brenda started on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. I was drinking coffee on my back deck when I heard engines rumbling. I walked around the side of my house and froze. 3 men in work boots were standing on the grassy drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of my property, pointing at stakes they had driven into the ground. "Can I help you?" I called out. The oldest of the 3, a guy with a sun-weathered face and a clipboard, looked up. "HOA hired us to do some landscaping improvements. This whole drainage area is getting a makeover." I felt my jaw tighten. That drainage ditch serves my property. Water from my gutters and my yard drains into it. Did anyone bother to check the property survey? The guy shrugged. "Lady from the HOA said it was all common area. We just do what we are told, man." I pulled out my phone and called Brenda immediately. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Hello, James. What can I do for you?" "You can tell me why there are landscapers on my property planning to mess with my drainage system." "The drainage ditch is a community eyesore," she said, as if explaining basic math to a child. "The board voted to beautify it. We are filling it in, adding topsoil and planting native flowers. It will increase everyone's property values." "Brenda, that ditch is there for a reason. When it rains, water flows down from the street, through my yard and into that ditch. It drains into the retention pond at the end of the street. If you fill it in, where does the water go?" "James, I appreciate your concern, but the board has already approved this project. The landscaping company assured us everything is up to code." "Did you consult an engineer, a hydrologist, anyone who actually understands drainage?" Her voice turned cold. "The meeting minutes are public record. If you had attended the meeting last month, you could have voiced your concerns then. The project begins today." She hung up before I could respond. I spent the next hour making calls. First, I contacted the county planning office, but they told me that HOA landscaping projects on private community land did not require county permits as long as they were not altering public right-of-ways. Then I called a property attorney named Richard Moss who had helped me with my home purchase years ago. "You have an easement documented for that drainage?" Richard asked. "I don't think so. It was just part of the original development plan. The builder put it in when they graded the lots." "Then technically, if the HOA owns that strip of land, they can landscape it. But if their work causes damage to your property, you would have grounds for a lawsuit. So I just have to wait for my house to flood, document everything, take photos, save emails, Keep records of any water issues you have had in the past. If this goes south, you will need evidence. By the time I got off the phone, the landscaping crew had already started working. I spent the rest of the day taking photos and videos from every angle. The ditch was about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, lined with river rock that allowed water to flow freely. It had been there since the neighborhood was built, doing its job quietly and efficiently. Over the next 4 days, I watched them destroy it. They pulled out the river rock, filled the entire ditch with compacted soil, and covered it with fresh sod. Then they planted rows of black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers. I had to admit, it looked nice. But I kept thinking about what would happen when the spring rains came. I tried reasoning with Brenda 2 more times. The first time, she told me I was being paranoid. The second time, she threatened to fine me for harassment of HOA officials. I documented both conversations in emails, making sure to copy the entire board. March turned into April and the weather stayed dry. I started to wonder if maybe I was overreacting. The landscaped area looked good, and none of my neighbors seemed concerned. A few of them even complimented the HOA on the improvement. Then the forecast changed. On April 23rd, a meteorologist on the local news announced that a slow-moving weather system was heading toward Georgia. The National Weather Service predicted 3 to 5 inches of rain over a 48-hour period starting April 26th. It was exactly the kind of sustained rainfall that would test every drainage system in the county. I sent one final email to Brenda and the HOA board. I kept it short and factual. The weather forecast shows heavy rain this weekend. I remain concerned that filling in the drainage ditch will cause flooding. Please have a plan in place to address any water issues that arise. Brenda responded within an hour. Your concerns are noted. The landscaping project was completed to the highest standards. There is no reason to expect any problems. The rain started on Friday evening, right on schedule. It was not dramatic at first, just a steady drizzle that darkened the sky and made everything smell like wet asphalt. I stood at my kitchen window, watching water begin to pool in my backyard. Normally, the water would have flowed toward the eastern edge of my property and into the drainage ditch. But the ditch was gone, replaced by a gently sloping lawn that was already starting to look soggy. The water had nowhere to go, so it just sat there, slowly spreading across my grass. By midnight, the rain had intensified. I could hear it hammering against my roof, pouring out of my gutters in sheets. I put on a raincoat and boots and went outside with a flashlight. My backyard had transformed into a shallow pond. Water was lapping against my back deck, maybe 6 inches deep in places. But the real problem was becoming visible along the property line. Water from my yard, from the neighbor's yard, and from the street above was all converging on the spot where the drainage ditch used to be. With nowhere to go, it was starting to flow sideways, spreading across the landscaped area and turning the fresh sod into a muddy swamp. The water was moving downhill, following gravity toward the street. I called Brenda. It went straight to voicemail. I called 2 board members whose numbers I had from previous HOA emails. No answer. By Saturday morning, the situation had escalated from concerning to catastrophic. I woke up at dawn and looked out my front window to see something I had never seen before in Meadowbrook Hills. Oak Ridge Drive was flooded. Water covered the asphalt from curb to curb, at least 8 inches deep in the center of the street, and it was still raining. I pulled on yesterday's still damp boots and splashed out to the street. Water was pouring down from the properties on the uphill side, where the filled-in ditch used to redirect the flow. Instead of being channeled toward the retention pond, the water was sheeting across yards and driveways, carrying mud, mulch, and garden debris straight into the street. The retention pond was at the end of the street, about 200 yards away, but the water was not reaching it fast enough. The street drains were overwhelmed, gurgling uselessly as thousands of gallons of water bypassed them entirely. My neighbor across the street, a retired police officer named Doug, waded out in his waders. "What the hell happened?" "I have been here 8 years and never seen the street flood like this." "The HOA filled in the drainage ditch," I said, pointing toward where the ditch used to run. "All that water used to flow through there." Doug's face darkened. "You have got to be kidding me." By 9 in the morning, half the street was outside surveying the damage. 3 houses on the lower end of Oak Ridge Drive had water seeping into their garages. One family had a finished basement that was taking on water. People were trying to build sandbag barriers, move cars to higher ground, and salvage what they could. My phone rang. It was Brenda. "James, several residents have called to report flooding," she said, her voice tight. "Do you know what is happening?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "Yes, Brenda, I know exactly what is happening. The drainage system that used to handle runoff from this entire section of the neighborhood no longer exists because your landscaping project filled it in. The water has nowhere to go, so it is flooding the street and people's homes." There was a long pause. "The landscaping company assured us." "I don't care what they assured you. I warned you this would happen. I sent emails, I called. You ignored me, and now people's houses are flooding." "There is no need to take that tone. There is every need, Brenda. Get someone out here to fix this. Now." I hung up before she could respond. The rain continued throughout Saturday, sometimes easing to a drizzle, sometimes intensifying to a downpour. The water in the street rose to over a foot in some places. 2 cars that had been parked on the street were sitting in water up to their wheel wells. The family with the flooded basement had to call an emergency water extraction company, who showed up in a truck and started pumping water out with industrial equipment. By Saturday evening, a local news crew had somehow gotten word of the flooding and showed up with a camera. A young reporter in a bright yellow rain jacket interviewed Doug and several other neighbors, all of whom explained what the HOA had done. When the reporter asked to speak with someone from the HOA board, Brenda was suddenly unavailable. I gave an interview too, standing in my front yard with the flooded street visible behind me. I told them this would happen. I explained how the drainage system worked. They ignored me because they wanted to make things look pretty without understanding the consequences. Now people are dealing with thousands of dollars in damage. The segment aired on the 11 o'clock news. My phone started buzzing with texts from neighbors I barely knew, thanking me for speaking up. Sunday morning brought a break in the rain, but the damage was done. The street was still flooded, though the water level had dropped a few inches. The real problem was going to be the next rainfall, and the one after that. Spring in Georgia meant frequent storms, and the drainage problem was not going away on its own. I spent Sunday afternoon walking the neighborhood, documenting everything with photos and videos. I measured the water depth in multiple locations. I interviewed neighbors about the damage to their properties. One family had lost their hot water heater because their basement had flooded. Another had a ruined collection of storage boxes full of keepsakes and documents. On Monday, I received an email from Brenda calling for an emergency HOA meeting on Wednesday evening. The subject line read, "Community Flooding Discussion." The meeting was held at the clubhouse, a bland rectangular building near the neighborhood entrance with a community room that could hold about 50 people. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the parking lot already packed. I had to park on the street and walk. Inside, every seat was taken. People lined the walls and crowded near the doors. I spotted Doug, the family with the flooded basement, and at least 30 other residents I recognized. The mood was tense. Brenda sat at a table at the front of the room with 3 other board members: Linda Vasquez, the treasurer, Mike Chen, the secretary, and Patricia Holmes, the vice president. They all looked uncomfortable. Brenda called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp. "Thank you all for coming. I know this weekend was difficult for many of you. We are here to discuss the flooding situation and determine next steps." A man in the front row stood up immediately. "Next steps? How about you fix what you broke?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Brenda held up her hand. "I understand emotions are running high. The board takes this situation very seriously. We have been in contact with the landscaping company and they are reviewing what happened." "Reviewing?" Doug's voice cut through the noise. "Lady, you destroyed a drainage ditch that was working perfectly fine. This is not complicated. You created a flood hazard and now people's homes are damaged." "We followed proper procedures," Brenda insisted. "The landscaping plan was approved by a licensed contractor." I stood up. "Did that contractor evaluate the drainage impact? Did they model where the water would go? Or did they just make the area look pretty without considering the consequences?" Brenda's face flushed. "James, you have made your position clear, and I was right. I told you this would happen, and you ignored me. Now families are dealing with flooded basements and ruined property. What is the HOA going to do to make this right?" The room erupted in voices. People were shouting questions, demanding answers, venting frustration. Linda, the treasurer, looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Mike was frantically typing on his laptop. Patricia just stared at the table. Brenda banged a gavel, an actual wooden gavel, on the table. "Order, we need order." It took several minutes for the room to quiet down. Finally, Brenda spoke again, her voice strained. "The board will hire an independent engineer to assess the situation. We will also be reviewing our options with the HOA's insurance carrier. In the meantime, if you have experienced property damage, please submit a written claim to the board." "When will the drainage be fixed?" someone called out. "We are working on a timeline," Brenda said vaguely. "That is not an answer," Doug said. "We have more rain in the forecast for next week. If you do not fix this before then, we are going to have the same problem all over again. These things take time. People's homes are at risk." A woman near the back shouted, "You do not have time." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. People were yelling over each other, demanding immediate action, threatening lawsuits. Brenda tried to maintain control but eventually gave up. She adjourned the meeting 20 minutes early, and she and the other board members hurried out a side door while angry residents crowded around, still shouting questions. I left the clubhouse feeling drained. Doug caught up with me in the parking lot. "This is going to get ugly," he said. "It already is ugly." "No, I mean legally ugly. People are talking about hiring lawyers. Someone mentioned a class action lawsuit." I nodded slowly. "Brenda made a bad call and she is not taking responsibility. If the HOA does not fix this fast, people are going to have no choice but to sue." "Are you going to join them?" "My house did not flood, but my yard is a mess. I don't know yet. I want to see what the engineer says." The rest of the week was tense. The weather stayed dry, which helped the water recede, but the street and several yards were left with mud and debris. The family with the flooded basement got an estimate for repairs: $11,000. The ruined hot water heater and damaged drywall added up fast. On Friday, the HOA finally sent out an email. An engineering firm called Summit Civil Engineering had been hired to assess the drainage situation. They would be on site the following Monday to conduct their evaluation. In the meantime, The board reminded everyone to submit damage claims in writing. I spent the weekend researching Summit Civil Engineering. They were a legitimate firm based in Marietta, Georgia, with a decent reputation. I found their website, read reviews, and even looked up the lead engineer who would be handling the assessment. His name was Robert Kemp, and he had 20 years of experience in stormwater management. Monday afternoon, I watched from my front porch as Robert and a younger associate arrived in a white pickup truck with the Summit logo on the door. They spent 3 hours measuring, photographing, and taking notes. I waited until they were finishing up, then walked over to introduce myself. "James Lawson," I said, extending my hand. "I live right there. I tried to warn the HOA this would happen." Robert shook my hand. He was in his 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. "I read the emails you sent to the board. You were right. Can you fix it?" "The fix is not complicated. The original drainage system needs to be restored. The question is cost and timeline." "How much are we talking?" "Ballpark. 30 to 40,000 to excavate, reinstall proper drainage materials, and restore the system correctly. Maybe 6 weeks of work, weather permitting." I let out a low whistle. The HOA is not going to be happy about that. The HOA should have consulted an engineer before they started digging. This was entirely preventable. Robert's written report was delivered to the board a week later. I did not see it directly, but Doug had a friend on the board who leaked him a copy, and Doug forwarded it to me. The report was blunt and damning. It confirmed that filling in the drainage ditch had eliminated a critical component of the neighborhood's stormwater management system. It detailed how water that used to be channeled safely away was now flooding the street and adjacent properties. And it recommended immediate restoration of the original drainage system at an estimated cost of $38,000. The report also included a section on liability. Robert noted that the flooding was a direct and foreseeable result of the landscaping project, and that the HOA could be held responsible for any property damage caused by their actions. Brenda called another meeting for the following Wednesday. This time, the atmosphere was different. People were not just angry, they were organized. Several residents had already hired lawyers. A group had drafted a petition demanding the board restore the drainage system within 30 days or resign. Brenda looked exhausted as she opened the meeting. "I assume most of you have heard about the engineer's report. The board has reviewed it carefully, and we accept the recommendation to restore the drainage system." There were murmurs of relief. "However," Brenda continued, "the cost is significant. Our annual budget does not have funds available for a project of this scale. We will need to either levy a special assessment on all homeowners or take out a loan." The room exploded. "You want us to pay for your mistake?" someone shouted. "We already pay HOA dues," another voice yelled. Doug stood up, his face red. "Absolutely not. The board made this decision without proper oversight. You do not get to pass the cost on to the rest of us." Brenda looked at Linda, the treasurer, who reluctantly stood up. "Our reserve fund has about $18,000. That covers half the cost, but we need to come up with the rest somehow." "Use the HOA's insurance," I said. Everyone turned to look at me. "The engineer's report clearly states that the flooding was caused by the landscaping project. That is what liability insurance is for." Brenda shifted uncomfortably. "We have been in contact with our insurance carrier. They are reviewing the claim." "Reviewing?" I pressed. "What does that mean?" "It means they are determining coverage. These things take time." "Meanwhile, people are living with flood damage," Doug said. "Some folks have had to pay out of pocket already because they cannot wait for the HOA to figure this out." A woman named Rachel Green, whose basement had flooded, stood up. Her voice shook with emotion. My family has lived here for 4 years. We love this neighborhood. But we have spent $11,000 repairing our basement, and we do not know if we are ever going to get that money back. This is not right. You all made a decision that hurt us, and you need to fix it." The room went silent. Rachel sat down, wiping tears from her eyes. Patricia Holmes, the vice president, finally spoke. "I think we need to take a vote. I move that the board commit to restoring the drainage system using HOA funds, including reserves and insurance proceeds, without levying a special assessment on homeowners." "Second," Mike Chen said immediately. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue but saw the mood of the room. All in favor, 3 hands went up: Patricia, Mike, and Linda. Opposed, Brenda was the only one. "The motion passes," Patricia said firmly. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics and timelines. The board agreed to hire Summit Civil Engineering to oversee the restoration project. Work would begin as soon as contracts were signed and materials ordered. In the meantime, homeowners who had paid for flood damage repairs could submit claims to the HOA for reimbursement, pending insurance approval. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. It was not a perfect solution, but it was progress. The insurance fight turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. The HOA's carrier, a company called Homestead Mutual, argued that the flooding was caused by faulty workmanship and was therefore not covered under the general liability policy. They claimed the landscaping company should be held responsible. The board hired a lawyer named Gregory Walsh to fight the insurance denial. Gregory was a sharp guy in his early 40s who specialized in HOA disputes. He argued that the policy covered damages resulting from the HOA's decisions and actions, regardless of whether those actions involved hiring a contractor. While the legal battle dragged on, the weather did not cooperate. Another storm system moved through in early May, dropping 2 inches of rain overnight. Oak Ridge Drive flooded again, though not as badly as the first time. Still, it was enough to terrify the families who had already dealt with water damage. Rachel Green's basement took on water again. Even though she had installed a sump pump after the first flood, the stress was taking a toll on everyone. Doug told me his wife was having trouble sleeping because she kept worrying about the next rainstorm. Another neighbor, a young couple with a toddler, decided to sell their house and move. They listed it in mid-May, but the recent flooding scared off potential buyers. After 2 weeks on the market with no offers, they dropped the price by $20,000. I was lucky. My house had not flooded, and my yard was recovering. But I felt the weight of the situation every time I looked at the landscaped area where the drainage ditch used to be. The flowers had died, strangled by too much water and compacted soil. The sod was patchy and brown. It was an ugly scar on the neighborhood. In late May, the insurance dispute finally reached a resolution. Homestead Mutual agreed to cover the cost of restoring the drainage system, minus a $5,000 deductible, but refused to pay for individual homeowner damages. That meant the HOA would still need to tap into reserves to cover the deductible and reimburse residents like Rachel. Gregory Walsh advised the board to pursue a separate claim against the landscaping company for negligence. The company, which was called Greenscape Solutions, had dissolved its LLC and gone out of business 2 weeks after the flooding. The owner, a guy named Randy Phillips, had apparently faced similar lawsuits in other states and decided to cut his losses. "He is judgment-proof," Gregory explained at a board meeting I attended. "Even if we sue him and win, there is no money to collect. The company is defunct, and Randy does not have personal assets worth pursuing." It was a frustrating dead end, but at least the drainage restoration was moving forward. Summit Civil Engineering broke ground on the project in early June. I watched crews arrive with excavators and dump trucks, tearing up the landscaped area and digging down to expose the compacted soil. They worked methodically, removing several truckloads of dirt before starting to rebuild the ditch. Robert Kemp was on site most days, supervising the work and making sure everything was done correctly. I talked to him one afternoon while he was reviewing blueprints. "This should have been simple," Robert said, shaking his head. "The original system was well designed. All they had to do was leave it alone. Think it will hold up now, better than before. We are using larger drainage pipes, more rock, and better grading. This thing will handle runoff from a 100-year storm." The work took 4 weeks. By the first week of July, the new drainage system was complete. It looked different from the original, more engineered, less natural, but it was functional. Water flowed smoothly through the restored ditch, following the intended path toward the retention pond. The first real test came in mid-July when a thunderstorm dropped 3 inches of rain in 2 hours. I stood on my front porch, watching water pour down the street and into the drainage system. It worked perfectly. No flooding, no backup, no water pooling in yards. Oak Ridge Drive stayed dry. Doug texted me a photo from his front window with the caption, "Hallelujah." But the damage from the original flooding was not forgotten. Rachel and 3 other families whose homes had been damaged filed a joint lawsuit against the HOA, seeking reimbursement for repairs and additional damages. Their lawyer argued that the board had been negligent in approving the landscaping project without proper engineering review. The case moved slowly through the legal system. Depositions were taken, documents were exchanged, and both sides prepared for trial. The HOA's lawyer, Gregory Walsh, tried to negotiate a settlement, but the homeowners wanted full compensation plus legal fees. In September, the case went to mediation. I was not directly involved, but Doug kept me updated since he was friendly with Rachel. The mediator, a retired judge named Harold Finch, spent a full day shuttling between rooms, trying to broker a deal. By late afternoon, they reached an agreement. The HOA would pay a total of $43,000 to the 4 families, covering repairs, temporary housing costs during remediation, and a portion of their legal fees. In exchange, the homeowners would drop the lawsuit and sign a release preventing future claims related to the flooding. It was expensive, but it was over. The financial impact on the HOA was significant. Between the drainage restoration, the insurance deductible, the settlement payments, and legal fees, the total cost exceeded $90,000. The reserve fund was wiped out. To replenish it, the board had no choice but to raise HOA dues by 30% starting in January 2025. People were furious, but there was nothing to be done. The money had to come from somewhere. In October, a group of residents organized a recall petition targeting Brenda Patterson. They gathered signatures from over 60% of homeowners and called for a special election. Brenda fought it, arguing that the recall was retaliatory and unfair, but the HOA bylaws were clear. If enough homeowners demanded a vote, one had to be held. The election took place in early November. Brenda lost by a landslide. Patricia Holmes, the vice president who had voted to restore the drainage system, was elected as the new HOA president. Brenda sent a bitter email to the neighborhood email list the day after the election, blaming a small group of vocal complainers for undermining her leadership. She claimed she had only been trying to improve the community and had been unfairly scapegoated for an unforeseeable problem. I deleted the email without responding. So did most people. Patricia's first act as president was to hire a new property management company that specialized in HOA oversight. She also created a new rule requiring board approval from a licensed engineer for any project involving grading, drainage, or stormwater systems. "We are not making this mistake again," Patricia said at her first meeting as president. Life in Meadowbrook Hills slowly returned to normal. The drainage ditch continued to do its job quietly and efficiently. The street stayed dry through the winter rains. Property values, which had dipped slightly after the flooding, began to recover. Rachel Green's family stayed in the neighborhood, though she told me it had been a close call. "We almost left," she admitted one day when I ran into her at the mailbox. "But we love our house, and now that the drainage is fixed, we feel safe again." Doug retired from his position as the neighborhood's unofficial watchdog, satisfied that the problem had been solved. "I am too old for this drama," he joked. "Let someone else fight the next battle." As for me, I learned an important lesson about HOA governance. Silence equals consent. If I had not spoken up, documented everything, and pushed back against Brenda's terrible decision, the flooding might have been dismissed as a freak accident instead of a preventable disaster. In early 2025, I ran for a position on the HOA board and won. I figured if I was going to live in a neighborhood with an HOA, I might as well help make sure it was run competently. My first priority was transparency. I pushed for monthly financial reports to be posted online, for board meetings to be recorded and made available to residents, and for major decisions to require homeowner input before approval. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered. One evening in March 2025, almost exactly a year after the flooding, I stood on my back deck watching a spring rainstorm roll through. Water poured off my roof, ran across my yard, and flowed smoothly into the drainage ditch. I could hear the water rushing through the system, carrying runoff safely away from homes and streets. It was a simple thing, really. A ditch, some rock proper grading, nothing fancy, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. I thought about Brenda, who had moved to a different neighborhood across town. I wondered if she had learned anything from the disaster she had created. Probably not. People like her rarely did, but the rest of us had learned. We learned that HOAs have power, but that power comes with responsibility. We learned that good intentions are not enough if you do not understand the consequences of your actions. And we learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is speak up when you see something going wrong, even if no one wants to listen. The rain continued to fall, steady and strong. The street stayed dry. The drainage system hummed along, invisible and essential. And life in Meadowbrook Hills went on. Patricia Holmes turned out to be exactly the kind of HOA president the neighborhood needed. She was methodical, fair, and willing to listen. Under her leadership, the board tackled several long-neglected projects: repaving the clubhouse parking lot, updating the community pool, and negotiating better rates with the lawn service that maintained common areas. But more importantly, she changed the culture. Board meetings became less confrontational and more collaborative. Homeowners felt heard instead of dismissed. Decisions were made with input from the community rather than handed down from on high. I found myself enjoying the board work more than I expected. It was satisfying to be part of something constructive after months of fighting against something destructive. My background in project management, I worked as an operations manager for a logistics company, translated well to HOA governance. I helped streamline processes, create better documentation systems, and establish clear timelines for projects. In April 2025, the board approved a new landscaping project. This time, we did it right. We hired Summit Civil Engineering to review the plans before any work began. We held a community meeting to explain what we were doing and why. We answered questions, addressed concerns, and made adjustments based on homeowner feedback. The project was simple, replacing some overgrown shrubs near the neighborhood entrance with native plants that required less water and maintenance. Robert Kemp reviewed the plans and confirmed there would be no impact on drainage or stormwater flow. The work was completed in 2 weeks without incident. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. We had taken something that went horribly wrong and used it as a learning experience to do better. In June, I got a phone call from a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She was writing a feature story about HOA disputes and had heard about the Meadowbrook Hills flooding through her research. She wanted to interview me about what happened and how the community recovered. I agreed, figuring it might help other neighborhoods avoid similar mistakes. The interview took place at a coffee shop in Marietta. The reporter, a woman in her 30s named Alicia, recorded our conversation on her phone while taking notes on a laptop. "Walk me through what happened," she said. "Start from the beginning." I told her the whole story. Brenda's decision to fill in the drainage ditch, my warnings that went ignored, the flooding during the spring rainstorm, the damage to homes, the legal battles, and the eventual resolution. I showed her photos I had taken during the flooding and after the drainage restoration. Alicia asked good questions. "Why do you think Brenda ignored your concerns?" "I think she was more focused on aesthetics than functionality." She wanted the neighborhood to look nice, which is fine, but she did not understand that some things exist for practical reasons. The drainage ditch was not pretty, but it was necessary. "Do you think this could happen in other neighborhoods?" "Absolutely." A lot of HOAs are run by well-meaning people who do not have expertise in engineering, construction, or land management. They make decisions based on what looks good, or what seems like a good idea without fully understanding the consequences. That is why oversight and professional consultation are so important. The article was published in July 2025. It was titled, "When HOAs Get It Wrong, A Georgia Neighborhood's Costly Drainage Disaster." The piece was fair and well-researched. It included interviews with Rachel Green and Doug, quotes from Robert Kemp and Gregory Walsh, and a response from Brenda, who maintained that she had acted in good faith and been unfairly blamed for an unfortunate situation. The article sparked a lot of online discussion. People shared their own HOA horror stories in the comments section. Some were worse than ours: tales of abusive board members, discriminatory enforcement of rules, and financial mismanagement. Reading them made me grateful that our situation, while bad, had been resolved relatively quickly. By the fall of 2025, Meadowbrook Hills had mostly moved on from the flooding. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the drama that had unfolded. The young couple who had listed their house after the flooding eventually sold it, though they took a loss. A family with 3 kids bought it and seemed happy. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I continued serving on the HOA board, handling mundane tasks like reviewing architectural requests and approving budgets. Patricia ran meetings efficiently, and the other board members, Linda, Mike, and a new member named Greg Thornton, worked well together. In December, I was walking my dog one evening when I saw Doug outside putting up Christmas lights. I stopped to chat. "Can you believe it has been almost 2 years?" Doug said, adjusting a string of lights along his roofline. "Feels like longer. Remember how crazy it was. The flooded street, the news crews, the angry meetings. Hard to forget." Doug climbed down from his ladder and stood back to admire his work. "I have been thinking about it lately." What happened here could have torn this neighborhood apart. People were talking about lawsuits, about moving, about burning the whole HOA down. But somehow we came through it. Patricia helped, and getting rid of Brenda. Sure, but it was more than that. People stepped up. You stepped up. You documented everything, you spoke up when it mattered, you kept pushing even when Brenda tried to shut you down. That made a difference. I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I just did not want my house to flood. Doug laughed. Maybe. But you did not have to keep fighting after your house was fine. You could have said, "Not my problem," and walked away, but you did not. You helped people like Rachel who needed someone in their corner. I thought about that as I walked home. Doug was right in a way. I could have stayed silent after it became clear my house was not going to flood. But something about the situation had bothered me deeply. It was not just about property damage or money. It was about accountability. Brenda had made a bad decision, and when confronted with evidence that she was wrong, she had doubled down instead of admitting the mistake. That kind of arrogance, that refusal to listen or learn, was dangerous. If left unchecked, it would have caused more problems down the line. By forcing the issue, by documenting everything and demanding action, I had helped create accountability. It was not satisfying in a dramatic way. There was no moment of triumph, no villain brought to justice. Just a slow, bureaucratic process of fixing what was broken and making sure it did not happen again. But that was how real change happened. Not through grand gestures, but through persistent, unglamorous work. In early 2026, I decided not to run for re-election to the HOA board. I had served for a year, helped implement some good changes, and felt like it was time to step back and let someone else take over. A younger guy named Marcus Wu, an engineer who worked for a construction firm, ran for my seat and won. He brought fresh energy and technical expertise that would serve the board well. At my last board meeting in March 2026, Patricia presented me with a plaque that read, "In appreciation for dedicated service to Meadowbrook Hills HOA." It was a nice gesture, even if it felt a little silly. After the meeting, Patricia pulled me aside. "You set a good example," she said. "You showed people that you can push back against bad decisions without being destructive. That is not easy." "I just did not want the neighborhood to flood again," she smiled. "Whatever your reasons, it mattered." Thank you. Spring arrived, bringing with it the usual Georgia thunderstorms. Each time rain was forecast, I found myself checking the weather radar obsessively, old habits dying hard. But the drainage system continued to work flawlessly. Water flowed where it was supposed to flow. Streets stayed dry. No one's basement flooded. In late April, I ran into Rachel at the grocery store. Her kids were with her, energetic and loud in the way that kids are. She looked happy. "How is everything?" I asked. "Good, really good. We just finished renovating the basement. New carpet, fresh paint, better waterproofing. It looks amazing." "That is great." I was terrified to do it, honestly. I kept thinking, what if it floods again? But Marcus, the new guy on the board, came over and looked at the drainage system with me. He explained how it all works now, showed me the improvements. I feel safe. "I am glad." She hesitated, then added, "I know I said this before, but thank you for everything, for speaking up, for fighting when we needed someone to fight. We would not still be here if it were not for you." I did not know what to say to that, so I just smiled and changed the subject. But her words stayed with me. That evening, I stood on my back deck with a beer, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The drainage ditch ran quietly along the edge of my property, doing its job without fanfare or recognition. The street was calm, the houses were lit with warm light, and everything felt settled. It occurred to me that this was what good governance looked like. Not dramatic or heroic, just functional. Systems that worked, problems that got solved, communities that took care of each other. It had taken a disaster to get there. Money had been spent, relationships had been strained, and people had suffered real harm. But in the end, the neighborhood had come together, held the right people accountable, and fixed what was broken. That was something worth protecting. As I stood there, I heard the distant rumble of thunder. Another storm was rolling in, just like the one 2 years ago that had started everything. But this time, I was not worried. The drainage system was solid. The HOA was competent. The neighborhood was prepared. I finished my beer and went inside as the first drops of rain began to fall. Outside, water flowed through gutters and downspouts, across yards and into the drainage ditch, following the path it was designed to follow. The system worked, and that, I thought, was all anyone could really ask for. Not perfection, not drama, not glory. Just things working the way they were supposed to work, quietly and efficiently, keeping people safe. The rain picked up, drumming steadily against the roof. I settled onto my couch and turned on the television, confident that when I woke up tomorrow morning, the street would be dry, the neighbors would be fine, and life in Meadowbrook Hills would go on just as it should. Sometimes the best outcome is the boring one. The one where nothing exciting happens because everything is working correctly. Where problems get solved before they become disasters. Where leaders listen to warnings instead of ignoring them. Where communities function the way they are supposed to function. That was what we had now. It had taken a flooded street, tens of thousands of dollars, and months of stress to get there. But we had gotten there, and that, in the end, was enough.